protest.
People became more outspoken, wanting to get more involved, unwilling to trust the government.
The plan is to spray new brush and tree sprouts with chemicals.
Our western campgrounds have been taken over by what may best be described as colonies of people, hippie type.
Well, it is a time of crisis, I guess you might say. A time of uncertainty, anyway.
I now turn to a subject which, next to our desire for peace, may well become the major concern of the American people in the decade of the 70s. It is a cause of particular concern to young Americans because they, more than we, will reap the grim consequences of our failure to act on programs which are needed now if we are to prevent disaster later. Clean air, clean water, open spaces, these should once again be the birthright of every American.
The love affair started ending in the 60s, but the divorce didn't occur until the 70s with the Monongahela and the Bitterroot.
Two national forests, the Monongahela and the Bitterroot, focused national attention on the Forest Service. On the Bitterroot, timber managers were clear-cutting on steep slopes, then terracing the hillside to retain the soil.
They thought if we want to really maximize future growth, let's terrace those lands, you know, like rice paddy fields almost in China.
But geez, the people wouldn't settle for tearing down a mountain to get the trees to grow.
In the early 1970s, Gifford Pinchot, though he had died in 1946, re-entered the political stage once more, and he did so through the voice of his only son, Gifford Bryce Pinchot. In the Bitterroot Valley, Gifford Bryce stood within a clear cut launched by the Forest Service and denounced the Forest Service in his father's name.
He went to the Bitterroot and they took him to a clear cut called the Oh My God clear cut. Because when you come around the corner and you look at it, you go, oh my God. Because it's high on a hill and the road comes right into the middle of it, and it is the most awful looking thing.
I've been back to those terraced landscapes. The fact is they worked, but they just looked terrible. They looked very destructive.
In West Virginia, foresters on the Monongahela plan to regenerate valuable hardwoods by removing lesser quality trees.
People in some of these very critical communities could see these clear cuts out of their kitchen window.
Silviculturally, it made a lot of sense, but it was like poking the public in the eye.
Some local hunting groups were really angered at an extensive set of clear cutting that the Forest Service was doing. These were turkey hunters.
They'd go out to this favorite hunting spot and they'd find it had been completely clear cut, and the administrators of the Monongahela at that time said, now don't worry, we know what's best, just let us do it, in 5 years we'll show you an improved forest. And that didn't sell.
And so the turkey hunters got together with a couple of wildlife groups and they said, let's go to court and sue the Forest Service based on this old late 19th century law.
They went back to the old 1897 Act, which gave the Forest Service permission to cut trees that were either mature or large growth. And they said the Forest Service didn't have any authority to cut young trees.
The 1897 Organic Act essentially ruled out clear cutting.
And it didn't reflect modern forestry. That was one of the problems. So we said, we're not violating that.
The judge's decision was that the Forest Service was in total violation of the 1897 Act. And the Court of Appeals held it may not be good law, but Congress has to fix it.
And the Forest Service lost big and had to go back to Congress and have its whole Organic Act rewritten to authorize timber.
Beginning with the Wilderness Act, Congress passed a series of laws that shaped national forest management.
There were a whole set of laws passed that really had a powerful influence on the agency, and one of them that I pick out a lot is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act.
NEPA opened the decision-making process to the public and required that projects on public lands be studied by a variety of specialists to determine their environmental impact.
We had to stop just hiring foresters and engineers and really begin to hire people from a breadth of fields.
You've got to have a multidisciplinary approach with wildlife biologists and fisheries biologists and all other kinds of ologists involved.
I was in the camp of the, quote, we call them ologists, the forest biologists and hydrologists they weren't of that same mindset. They came from different schooling, they came from different backgrounds.
Until the late 60s, the Forest Service was characterized by a palpable uniformity in gender, ethnicity, background, education, and profession. They were of one mind, and you couldn't turn to the person at the next desk and say, what do you think of this, and get a really different answer.
As new professionals entered the agency, they began to diversify the workforce in many ways.
And so there was this double whammy of trying to fit into the workforce the new technical specialists and the females and minorities that were coming at the same time. So there were some social adjustments that had to be made.
The focus was on hiring of women and minority persons, and that was at a time when we were just starting to bring on women firefighters.
Probably in the 70s, we started to see the integration of women into the crew. I often wondered what a woman wanted to do to fight fire, to come down grubby, teeth all black, bruised shins, sore muscles, and finally my wife said, well, what do you want to do it for?
You were always being tested. There was always skepticism, but we did the work and they hired us back.
In the fall of 1963, the Forest Service decided that there should be an official woman's uniform. It had a smaller patch than the men's uniforms, and we didn't get a full-size badge. I now have a full-size badge, so you can see how far we've come.
I guess I didn't think of it as history when I was selected as the deputy forest supervisor. I looked at it as an opportunity. The Forest Service did recognize that things were changing, but it was difficult. Since then, when I've told people, about my background, and I said it was 1985 and I became the first woman forest supervisor, I've gotten reactions like, did it take the Forest Service that long?
At the same time new voices were coming into the agency, the environmental laws required the Forest Service to open its planning and decision-making process to a broader spectrum of the public.
This group wants to do this, and this group wants to do this, and this group wants to do this, and they all have a right to voice what they think they want to do with these forests. They're the owners coming out seeing how you're managing their land.
The Forest Service is really good about proposing to do new things, provide resources to different constituencies. It's good at saying to the recreationists, sure, we're happy to go build you another campground or a picnic area, and then turn to the timber industry and say, sure, we're happy to provide you a little more timber if your mill's running short, and then turn to the ranchers and say, we're happy to provide you grass for your cows, and then turn to the wildlife groups and say, yes, we're happy to protect habitat for elk so that you can go and hunt them, or turkeys or fish. They like to provide goods and services. People are happy when they provide goods and services. But in the post-World War II period, you can't provide everything that everybody wants all the time without there being some conflicts.
Forest Service planners correlated input from the public with data about natural resources. They hoped that by optimizing the variables, the new computer models would help determine the greatest good.
I think the argument was that you could have everything, the greatest good. You could have social benefits, economic benefits, environmental benefits, all on the same acre.
The question of which roadless areas to include in the National Wilderness Preservation System provided an early test of the public involvement process.
The Forest Service, I would have to say, was pretty stingy with wilderness areas in the beginning. We had a rather strict view of what wilderness was. It was pure.
The Forest Service argued that only the crown jewels of American nature should be protected as wilderness, that if we protected lesser areas, it would tarnish the whole wilderness system. But it was also because they didn't want any areas that had exploitable resources in them protected as wilderness.
Once you have wilderness, it's pretty easy. You got a line on a map, and you manage on this side of the line one way and this side of the line another way. Drawing lines on a map solves a lot of conflicts if you can agree on where the line is.
Where there were 62 million acres of roadless areas on the National Forest. Conservationists, wanting to be reasonable, proposed only 35 million acres to be studied as wilderness. Essentially, we were willing to let half go. But the Forest Service came out and proposed only 15 million acres as wilderness. And we felt betrayed, and we're very upset, and that's one of the reasons I left Washington, D.C. And that's actually what led to the formation of Earth First.
And I salute you, and I celebrate you, and I love you for being fellow warriors. Earth First!
At the same time that Earth First was using aggressive tactics to stop logging and road building, a natural event leveled an entire forest.
As most of you already know, we had a major eruption occurring at 8:32 approximately this morning on Mount St. Helens. The first report that we actually got about
The eruption raised a question of the greatest good. Was it better to salvage the fallen trees and replant the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, or use the event as a unique research opportunity?
And we went into that tremendous disturbed area, and lo and behold, there was all of these organisms that had survived and all of the structure that had survived. Even though we knew better, we were still thinking in terms of disturbances as destroying things, as laying waste, as eliminating everything from a place. And it doesn't.
The research branch, which had long been an independent part of the Forest Service, prevailed when the volcano was declared a national monument. The area would provide important information about how landscapes recover from major disturbances. The sweeping environmental and social changes of the 60s and 70s brought a conservative shift, including the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980.
The president was elected to bring about change. I was appointed to bring about change.
We had a new administration, and they felt that we should have a lot more timber harvest than the Forest Service had proposed in the plan.
The
Forest Service probably could cut about 25 billion board feet a year off the commercial forest lands within the national forest in perpetuity.
But when you got out on the ground and you started seeing things like, oh, wow, well, there's a rare and endangered species living in this drainage, and over here there's only 2 inches of soil, and it's on the type of rock formation that if we cut 6 trees, it's going to fall into the creek.
DeBonis formed a group within the Forest Service that sided with environmental organizations in challenging the agency's timber program.
And the first loyalty of these new professionals was not to the agency, but to their profession.
It has made for an interesting culture that a lot of people refer to as the combat biologist era, whereas as you were really there trying to have a say in a large organization and a system and the way it did business, and yet you really weren't welcome at the table, and the advice you were giving isn't the kind of advice that they really wanted to hear.
It was about a 10-year battle during the 1980s between environmentalists and the timber industry, between people within the Forest Service itself who wanted to get the cut out, and other ones who were saying, we shouldn't be doing, we can't do this, and we shouldn't be doing this.
We were beginning to feel the pressure from industry and communities to do what it was we were doing beyond maybe what we should be doing.
But we're going to be a little short. We're going to be short maybe 3 or 4 million board feet.
You know, we're only talking about 250 acres additional per year.
I'm very happy to try. And if we can, within these constraints, do it. But I'd rather leave it open-ended.
And I will be very honest with you, the agency got caught up in that scenario, and we went to the dark side. We began to be driven by our budget, and we began to be driven by the political pressures.
The drive to get out the cut it's a funny thing. I don't think, I mean, a lot of people would say, oh, it's because they're getting paid off. Well, I can guarantee you no one got paid off in the Forest Service. There was an attitude, an ethic that was very pro-logging.
We peaked out when I was chief, and I think one year, I don't remember which one it was, 1987, 1988, somewhere there, we harvested over 12 billion board feet. And that was the high year for the Forest Service.
We were a culture that believed that engineering and science could get us around it. If they didn't like clear cuts, we could use beauty strips, leaf strips along the highway. If a mountainside couldn't regenerate timber, we could fertilize. We terraced. We did all these mechanical things, all in the spirit of the utilitarian philosophy of man over nature.
And by the mid-'80s, it was apparent that no, you needed to start from a different philosophical base.
We stretched the multiple-use concept as far as we could to wrap our arms around these things, but it just wasn't big enough, and so that's when we had to go to a bigger concept of ecosystems management.
The scientific basis for a new approach to management came in part from Forest Service research on the west side of the Cascade Mountains in Oregon and Washington. The national forest there contained large trees that had been spared during logging's westward expansion. Environmentalists called these stands ancient forests. Timber managers called them overmature and decadent. To the public, they were known mostly as old growth.
Policy towards old growth in the Forest Service when I got started in the late 50s as a full-time professional was liquidation.
And they were, in a sense, decadent, that there were trees that were falling down and rotting and falling apart, and which we now look at as ecosystem attributes, at the time was viewed as huge waste.
In these old forests, that what we've been describing as decadence was in fact, in many senses, niches, places where different organisms could live.
One organism inhabiting the old growth was the northern spotted owl.
The Forest Service, it was dawning on them that at the rate that we were cutting against the old growth supply and at the rate we were fragmenting habitat, that we were going to have a collision with the Endangered Species Act. And it was probably going to be spotted owls, and if it wasn't that, it was going to be something else.
The timber sale program was enjoined by Judge Dwyer as a result of concerns over how the spotted owl was being accommodated on the national forest.
And of course, that just terminated the timber sale programs on the west side forests.
I could show you a graph that shows you a high level of sales till 1991, and then Judge Dwyer issued his court decision. It plummets down to near zero.
The sudden drop in timber supply devastated the rural economy in the Northwest.
In some communities, the Forest Service employees were looked upon as the enemy because we were part of the reason and part of the government that led to the reduced timber volumes.
The reality was that the owl really didn't create most of the problem that the timber industry was having.
In the end, we need to learn this was not about spotted owls, it's not about marble murrelets, it's about ecosystems.
As science revealed the complexity of ecosystems, ideas about forest management began to change. Understanding fire's role in the forest was an important lesson. After decades, when full fire suppression was federal policy, foresters began to recognize the benefits that fire brings to ecosystems.
Fire is not going to go away. It's going to be with us, and in fact, we need it. It's an ally, not an enemy. It does ecological work in many systems that nothing else does, and you have to have it.
The National Park Service has been a leader in changing fire policy toward the end of the 20th century. It began with a let burn policy. If a fire was started by lightning, that was nature, and you let it go. That policy was severely tested in 1988, when about 38% of Yellowstone Park went up in flames.
The conflagration in Yellowstone National Park, which resulted from too much fuel buildup over the years, dramatized the danger of just preventing fires. Yet controlled burns could also be dangerous, like the one that got out of hand in the year 2000 near the Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory. Fire management became a complicated issue.
Smokey Bear had a midlife crisis in 1994 at the time of the South Canyon fire. He was 50 years old in a year when 34 firefighters were killed.
Sometime in the middle of the night, the phone rang, and it was Deputy Chief, and he said, "Chief, we may have lost 45 firefighters at a place called South Canyon."
And fire suppression, the policy of fire suppression was blamed in part for those deaths.
It was a tragedy. And the real question was, should we have even been there in the first place? What was there to protect?
Well, the problem with Smokey is not that his message is bad, but that it only addresses one part of the problem, that we want to prevent the fires we don't want. It doesn't address the other side of fire management, which is to promote the fires we do want, and indeed, for which there is often some ecological necessity.
The wildland-urban interface is growing, and where you have fire and people mixing, you have people being injured and killed.
Living with fire is a greater challenge as the population grows, and more people live in or near the national forests.
You're not going to cut your way out of the problem. You're not going to burn your way out. You're certainly not going to suppress it. You can't walk away from it. And what we need are mixtures of those things applied to particular places.
Fire was not the only complex issue that public land managers faced at the end of the century. With the public tugging from different sides, it became difficult to answer the question, what is the greatest good?
Finding the greatest good, of course, is a tremendous challenge because it changes over the years.
Whose greatest good is it now? Whose greatest good will it be later?
And when Gifford Pinchot was chief, there were 75 million people. We now have almost 300 million people. Huge different resource needs, huge different interests of the American public.
If the era of intensive resource extraction from national forests was over, what would define the next stage of conservation?
I really believe that the future of the national forest is going to be, at least the next 10, 20, 30 years, is really going to be more of a restoration and a recreation time. And when I say restoration, I'm talking about watershed restoration, restoration of these fire-adapted ecosystems. You know, we've been taken from these national forests. They've built so many of our communities over the last 100 years. They've provided a tremendous amount of goods and services to the public, but it is time to reinvest in the national forest for the next generations, and that's what the restoration is all about.
Community forestry in the United States happens in rural communities and in urban communities. It's about local people getting together, bringing in all those competing interests, and saying, let's take care of the forest and let's take care of each other as we do that. The common ground is restoration and maintenance of these ecosystems.
Forestry in the United States has been a tremendous success story. Of course, the forests were, in the east and the south, were harvested before the turn of the century, but they've grown back, and at this point we have almost the same 90% of the land base that we had in forests that we had at the turn of the century, or shortly thereafter. So the forests have come back. They're not the same forests as before, certainly, but the land base is a pretty stable one.
In the eastern United States, the lands that nobody wanted are now enjoyed by millions.
The forest health issues, I think, are really beginning to resonate with the general public. They are concerned about having healthy forests, clean water, and wildlife habitat. And if it means man managing the resource to keep it healthy, I think they're going to be very accepting of that.
Cutting trees on public lands remains controversial, but society faces a difficult choice.
There's pressure on the other side that says perhaps we should have no commercial harvest from the federal lands and no manipulation and no management, and nature will take care of itself. You know, I think that they split the baby a long time ago. We had national parks, we have wilderness areas, there's a place for preservation. In the larger sense, though, we have to exploit our environment in order to live. That's not a question. The question is, how do we do that exploitation, whereby that the generations that follow ours will have the same opportunities that we have today.
As a nation, we've increased our consumption of both paper and wood products by about 1% per year per capita since about 1950. Yet we seem to spend all our time fighting about the supply side. And yet we're consuming more, and basically, where is this going to come from? And I say to the environmental community, is it ethical to export your environmental debt to another country that has lesser environmental protections than we do?
As population and consumption pressures put new demands on the global biosphere, Forest Service research investigates climate change, biodiversity, and the impact of exotic plants and diseases on native species.
409.
As scientists learn more about forest ecosystems, the national forests are increasingly valued for their ecological benefits. Recreation continues to expand as visitors place new pressures on the landscape. Yet the wilderness system, now nearly 5% of America's land, provides a place of solitude. The wolf, a symbol of wilderness for Aldo Leopold and others, is returning to the land, but not without considerable controversy.
People have concern about conflict and disagreement over public lands, but to me, that's kind of the normal state of affairs. There have actually been relatively few periods when we've been free of conflict. And in some respects, we wouldn't have such a rich legacy today if we hadn't had the conflict that we had in the past.
We own them. And so of course we're going to disagree about how they should be managed. The public lands, in effect, become the way by which we know we are democratic. We know the system is working because we are arguing about them.
If you're going to find maybe not the greater good, but at least the common good, then you need all of these interests at the table. When the community treats the forest as though it's part of the community, then you have a long-term sustainable system for natural resource management.
Managing a forest is a long-term proposition. Even on our industrial forest lands, you're looking at a 60-year time horizon. On public forest lands, you may be looking at several hundred years.
And we must be managing these forests for the future out 100 years.
Aldo Leopold said we need to have an ethic that no matter what the changing circumstances, and our science changes, and as our politics changes, that would still be there, and would still be driving people to ask, how can I live on this piece of land without spoiling it?
The work of the Forest Service can and should and must continue into the 21st century and beyond, because in a way, the issues that this agency has been struggling with since its creation are at the very core of what it means to be a human being on the planet and what it means to build a sustainable human society. And it is the struggle, not just of the United States, it's the struggle of humanity.
We shape the land, and the land shapes us. For 100 years, the U.S. Forest Service has grappled with the issues of how best to use, manage, and protect the public lands and waters of America. And throughout the next century, we will continue to seek the greatest good.